Basic errors of scholarship. The first error of all modern New Testament research is the acceptance of Markan priority. The essential mistake of the Markan hypothesis lies in the naive conclusion that by studying the facts related to pericope order alone, it is possible to determine the interdependence of our Gospels. Pericope order facts are important, but they are of such a nature that we cannot tell from them whether Mark is in the middle because Matthew and Luke independently use his Gospel, or whether Mark has depended upon one of the other synoptic works only to be followed by the third evangelist. Is the relationship Mark-Matthew-Luke, Matthew-Mark-Luke, or Luke-Mark-Matthew, the common story skeleton could have arisen under any of these solutions. To settle this question, one must add to his observations of pericope order the facts of verbal identity and disparity. Scholarship failed at this point, not so much because it did not notice that there was a problem, but because it failed to line up these facts with those of pericope order before arriving at a basic solution to the synoptic question. The ghost of this failure lifts its pale face each time a modern scholar learns, to his amazement, that Matthew and Luke appear to be heavily dependent upon Mark's pericope order, but radically divergent from Mark's exact wording. The same ghost rises silently in condemnation when scholars habitually and short-sightedly sweep under the rug the Matthean-Lucan agreements in Markan context. Markan priority cannot explain these facts. In other words, if we study the 36 pericope that Matthew and Luke share without Mark, we find that their wording is often exact for whole sentences and even paragraphs. But if we study the 78 stories they share with each 100 other, and with Mark, we find that Matthew and Luke occasionally agree on small words against Mark, but never agree for more than a few words with each other, even when Mark has the same wording. To put it another way, Matthew and Luke are able to copy the words of one of their sources, Q, according to Markan priority, with great exactitude. They cannot copy the other source, Mark, according to Markan priority, without making vast verbal changes. We can call this phenomenon the Markan cross factor, as I have suggested in a Hebrew translation of the Gospel of Mark 2:56, for it seems clear that Mark stands chronologically between the 78 pericope of Matthew and Luke, causing both the common pericope order of the synoptic materials and the severe verbal disparity between Luke and Matthew. It is also observable that in at least 19 of the 36 pericope Matthew and Luke share from the anthological text, so-called Q, verbal identity is almost exact, whereas with one or two exceptions, these 36 do not appear in the same pericope order in Matthew and Luke. Put again, Luke and Matthew share a common story order, normally in common with Mark, but differ verbally with each other rather severely opposite Mark. They agree closely with each other in verbal matters when transcribing their non-Markan parallels, yet disagree in pericope order in these materials. This is the Markan cross factor. Why do Matthew and Luke show such love for one source and such dislike for another, especially when the second source supposedly provides them with their common order? And how can they independently agree to use many small phrases and words against Mark? The answer to these questions cannot proceed along the usual lines of the Markan hypothesis. It cannot be true that Matthew and Luke often agree with each other verbally against Mark in Markan contexts, if they are only using Mark's text at these points. It is also highly improbable that they could independently come to the exact way of treating one source with verbal respect and the other with verbal disrespect. Much the simplest answer, if we are to retain any of the insights of Markan priority at all, is to suggest that it is the redacted character of Mark's text 101 which brought about the Matthean-Lucan verbal distance in Markan contexts. This will mean that Mark copied from Luke or Matthew, but was followed by one of the other authors whose work he did not use. Point of view will confirm the Markan priority contention that Matthew and Luke indeed do not know each other, but it will also insist that Matthew and Luke have not equally followed Mark. Instead, Mark has depended upon one and has radically reworded its text in his own version. This rewording has disturbed the third writer and caused the Matthean-Lucan verbal disparity in triple tradition material, which is so serious. And how have Matthew and Luke managed to agree in many words with each other against Mark? In Markan contexts, quite simply, one of these writers is using a text known to the other, document I call the anthology, but the writer who is chronologically third has also known Mark's divergent text. He has had to try to put Mark's redacted wording together with the earlier form of text which he sees in the anthology. Which gospel, Matthew or Luke, has Mark used?